Well, hello, everybody listening in on this podcast as part of our Front Runners and various other series. Today, we have an extremely interesting subject and a fascinating guest. I would like, first of all, to welcome Dr. Ulrike Anton, who is the director of the Arnold Schönberg Center in Vienna. And we're here today to talk about two composers, one of whom is Schönberg. Now, as many of you will know, there were two really interesting anniversaries in 2024. One of them, obviously, is the 150th anniversary that's just been celebrated of Arnold Schoenberg, but also this amazing Italian composer, Luigi Nono. I have to say, I'm standing here just very nicely placed because if you look now, you can actually see a picture of Nono from a festival from 2002, I think it was, Sound and Silence. So Luigi Nono, who was born in 1924. And there's a fascinating, complex series of connections, multi-layered between these two composers. So I thought it'd be great to actually talk to Ulrike, who's an expert, obviously, on Schönberg, about both Schönberg, also Luigi Nono, and two pieces of music that connect them in a very special way. So the two pieces of music are the Schönberg Opus 41, which Ulrike is going to talk about in a minute. And the other piece is that Luigi Nono, a few years after that was written, Nono wrote what was really his first proper published piece, I think, which was the canonic variations on this. And then the story gets more interesting in other connections. But first of all, Ulrike, this is terrible to ask. Just say to us in like a few sentences, Schönberg. What's the way you introduce, what's your elevator pitch for Schönberg?
Yes. So anyway, Marshall, thank you so much for the invitation on this podcast. And it really is a fascinating subject. And also here at the Schönberg Center, we had a study day with the subject of Schönberg and Nono. And I'm very, very happy that we're doing this together today. Yes, what is so fascinating about Schönberg? Of course, it's this amazing personality and also this multifaceted artist who was, of course, a composer, but also a writer, a teacher, a theoretical thinker, and a painter, an inventor. And so creativity is just such a sparkle with him. And that's why I also think that people are so fascinated about this personality of Arnold Schönberg. But of course, I mean, for the history of composition, he is one of the key figures of the 20th century by slowly developing this method of 12 tone. Yeah, so this 12 tone method, which through various steps of development, he finally created in the 1920s. And that has really revolutionized music in a way that no composer today or 50 years ago, or I think even in 200 years, can overlook what Schönberg has done. Even if you then say as a composer, no, that's not my path, but at some point you have to, develop through this method with 12 tones by Schönberg.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. So let's just situate Schönberg for a minute. It's the early 1940s. He's had to leave Europe because of the war. He's settled in the States, and then in the early 40s, is it 1943?
1942.
42, sorry. He writes this extraordinary piece, which also really situates himself right into kind of politics, society. He's often thought of as a very abstruse composer, you know, up there in the garret composing, not worrying if people come to his concerts. But actually, this piece puts you dead center in the world. Tell us about this piece.
Yes. So one has to know that Schönberg always was a very political person and also a very intellectual person and really a sort of thinker of the time who was very sensitive to also all the vibes that were going on already in the 1920s and of course in the 30s. And also Schönberg himself, being Jewish, was exposed to severe anti-Semitism, which marked him quite a bit. And again, there are several works that where you can see that. And one of them is this ode to Napoleon Bonaparte, where he took a poem by Lord Byron, which was created after Napoleon stepped down and was a clear sign against tyranny. And that was something very, very important to Schönberg. And that's why he used the poem and set it for speaker, string quartet, and piano. Again, it's a very it's a working 12th tone. However, already in this period in the United States, Schönberg, who was always developing his method further, did not have any problems to also again have some traces of tonality in the work, and that's why also it's particularly fascinating for us today to listen to it. And of course, a highly expressive work, and also a work that grabs you when you listen to it.
I think that last point is such an interesting one, and also when we go to talk about the Nono, it goes on in a very interesting way. But it is one of those pieces, highly expressionistic. It grabs you by the throat. It commands you to listen, and it's like as if you are in a kind of political protest situation where somebody's dragging you in, and it's very. I mean, it's heavy stuff, isn't it? It's really kind of grand, not grand so much, heavy, I would say. And what I found very interesting was that, this piece is written, and you can see its kind of obvious political connotations of Bonaparte and the empire. It reminds me of the Beethoven story of him scratching out Napoleon's name when he makes himself emperor. And there is that very strong political thing. And then what's so interesting is that, what is it? 7 years later, I think, in 1950, Luigi Nono, this young Italian radical, takes this piece and he does a series of variations, the canonic variations on it. And what astounded me when I went back to listen to the variations is how it both takes the inspiration of the Schönberg, but it also makes its own kind of commentary. In fact, I find it extraordinary. It reminds me of when I walk into a gallery and I have these paintings that are assaulting me almost. And then after a bit of time, I just step back into a kind of a silence. And Nono writes it in that way. In fact, I was going to say for any budding programmers here, I think doing the Op 41 and following it straight away with the canonic variations with no interval in between of clapping, suddenly it's like he takes this piece and he gives it a kind of respect and says, okay, let's just reflect on this. And I find Nono's not always known for or thought of as having this kind of poetic textual sound, but there is an extraordinary one into it. I don't know how you take these two pieces then together.
Yeah, listening again to the Nono in preparation of this, what really struck me is his use of the sound and sort of how he's blending the different instruments together, which in a way is very different from what you hear in the Schönberg. However, it's again what you said, the emotional content of both pieces is extremely high, though executed in a very different way.
That's right, and you're so right. If you look at the instrumentation and the voice of the Schönberg, and then Nono goes in a very different apparent direction. I mean, it's one of those ultimately eclectic chamber ensembles. I mean, it's over 20 players, I think. So it does that, but it gives him a really interesting palette to work with. And as I say, I think that makes these two pieces together an absolute fascination. But of course, something then goes on to happen in the future, which binds these two composers together in a completely different plane. I don't know whether you want to kind of tell the next bit of that story, but I was just thinking of Nuria and what happens then.
So on the first hand, it's of course very interesting how Nono came in touch with the music of Schönberg. And he had lessons with the conductor Hermann Scherchen actually conducting lessons during the Biennale, I think in 1947 in Venice, and continued to work with him. Also Bruno Maderna was one of his students. And this is when Nono was really sort of acquainted with works by the Second Viennese School, and especially also with Schönberg. it's interesting to see then how Nono, how deeply involved he was with Schönberg's works. It was not just the Ode to Napoleon, but for him totally fascinating, The Survivor from Warsaw, which of course also has this highly political and of course the Holocaust and everything background to it. And I think for Nono, also looking at his career, also his engagement with political and also subjects that are important to society, that is definitely something he was drawn to, apart from the musical skills of Schönberg, but also this political aspect of things, that works actually have a further meaning and sort of should have an impact. And I think that's definitely also something where both composers, where if you think of Intolleranza and things like that, so that's definitely something both composers have in common. And then what you were referring to, of course, there's a big family connection also, because he met Schönberg's daughter Nuria in 1954, actually at the premiere of Moses and Aaron. So Schönberg had already passed away in 51, but then the opera Moses and Aaron was never finished, and finally they did a concertant version in Hamburg, and this is where Luigi Nono went, and he met Nuria, and not too long afterwards that both of them got married. And so again, just imagine, I mean, marrying Schönberg's daughter, and so it's all, of course, a really, really fascinating subject. And of course, through Nuria, his involvement with all the everything surrounding Schönberg was then, of course, deepened also on a personal level.
That's right, and I think you're so right to look at these two planes of relationship. On the one hand, I mean, as we know, Nono became very well known for his radical political viewpoint. I mean, he's communist of the left, somebody who wanted to take took his music into factories. There's a fantastic video where he's taking one of the most abstruse contemporary works and he's discussing it with a worker in a factory, and done in a way that it's difficult to think of now, actually. So there's that one whole side of Schönberg through the Ops 41 and most of things like Moses and Aaron, but which Nono, it really was his destiny also, almost, to be this kind of social thinker, as thinking through music. But what's often ignored is the other aspect that you've just said, which is that in all sorts of technical ways, like so many of that generation, he's learning from Schönberg. And obviously we know in the 50s he then goes on to the Darmstadt school, where he was with people like Cage and Stockhausen and Boulez and all of those people. And what's fascinating is that Lachem and another one. If you look at all of those composers, it's almost as if Schönberg has laid out a table called the Darmstadt table, and they all arrive at it eventually. And that's that great kind of moment when a lot of that's done. And as you say, pieces like Intolleranza by Nono, then in a way, one of his great major works, that bring that kind of social aspect onto the agenda. And then that later, 1985, he did Prometeo, this amazing new way of actually setting a stage for musicians. I think he puts the players around, and the audience in the middle. And Schoenberg doesn't go so much into that kind of spatial side with his work, but there is this huge connection between the two. And I just think, in a way, 2024 has been kind of almost like Nuria's year. These two things, these two sides of the century that she held. I mean, let's take two of them actually. If you were talking to players in the European Union Youth Orchestra, what would be your way to advise them to approach Schönberg and his legacy?
Yes, I mean, definitely one has to look at Schönberg. He's looking at the works from the very early works onwards to, let's say, The Survivor from Warsaw. Yeah, so it's I think it's this development that is so fascinating. And if you do come from a piece like Verklärte Nacht, where already you see this is a composer who will certainly develop everything he has already laid out on the table even further. And then you come to pieces like Pierre Lunaire, where maybe when you study that for the first time is really hard. It's sort of But again, once you get into it and once you try to find your way through, then having performed Schönberg helps you to understand the music of the 20th century so much better, and it's so much more easy to tackle pieces. And again, this is why every student should go through a Schönberg phase just to find a system of how to approach these works. And then also, the more you work with Schönberg's works, the more substance you see in them, and the more joy it brings also to you once you have understood the connections.
Yeah, he's the Beethoven of the 20th century, in the way that Beethoven kind of strides everybody's looking over their shoulders in the 19th century of Beethoven. And even the composers that would say they didn't particularly enjoy a lot of the Schönberg, he's there in that. And I love this thing you talked about of going through the variety of it. I mean, it's like the project we did together in the summer, this composer with a foot in 4 centuries. And of course, the idea that Schoenberg himself had, which is, whatever sort of music you want to write, please start with some diatonic harmony. Then you can work through. And so I think that's so interesting. And I think that was one of the things that for Nono made him into such an important figure.
Yeah, what is of course very, very interesting is when Luigi Nono also was a part of the summer courses at Darmstadt, where really sort of the latest works were happening and were performed, and also where all these new composers gave also, they were basically faculty there talking about different topics. And Luigi Nono was the only one who was analyzing a piece by Schönberg. And then also when you look at Pierre Boulez's essay, Schönberg is dead, and sort of basically criticizing Schönberg for being attached too much to the past in his works. And then, of course, Nono being really an advocate for Schönberg, who saw the quality in this and also really was fascinated by Schönberg's idea that although he has developed this method, that this is not the end, developing it. It's a starting point for everything new. And I think this is what Nono picked up on. And this is also, I think, where in his works you can really find traces of Schönberg, but developed further. And this was Schönberg's idea that, here you've got the theory, and so now be creative with it.
I think that's so right. And it's such an interesting reflection. I remember somebody who once said to me many years ago in another context, said, if you don't respect your past, you have no future. And
That's right.
Definitely, it's interesting. It's not about being radical about change. Schoenberg and Nono were both extremely radical, but they were kind of being drawn by where the journey took them, it seems to me. There are some people who are drawn by the need for revolution, and that's all, for its own sake. And it is interesting in that sense that you're right, that the main thing, I suppose, is that, here's Darmstadt, as you say, which was, let's say in the 50s particularly, it was the place. It was the place where new music was being made, talked about, lectured, thought about. And yet, there's a way, Schönberg is arguably the most obvious lack of presence there. And it is interesting that some of them, like Boulez, as you say, were so, I think were so, angry young men, and they were men, most of them, they're anxious to get out there on the battlements and change society. And it wasn't that Nono and Schönberg didn't want to, it's just that they had they had an organic way of saying, here we are, we've come from there, what have we learned or not, let's go on, I suppose. It's fascinating to think of that, especially for younger composers today, where the table, as we talked about, is so much wider. I mean, so much more is possible. So interesting in that respect.
Yeah, and then also Boulez, of course, did change his mind and then gave the opening speech when the Schönberg Institute in Los Angeles was opened in 1977. So the Schönberg Institute is the place where the musical legacy of Schönberg was before it came to the Arnold Schönberg Center in Vienna. And there, Boulez, in his speech, admits that, yes, what Schönberg did no composer can pass that. And it's sort of the starting point of everything what we have then later on built. So
yeah, it's interesting. And I in the 70s, when I was a violinist, I was working on with Boulez. Boulez was conducting the BBC Symphony Orchestra. We did a lot of Schönberg, actually. I mean, his Veklet Nacht in the string version is some of the best performance of any music I've ever done.
Right.
And clearly there was respect there. I mean, you could see that.
Yeah. No, and also in his little bit older days, he realized, what a giant.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, it's interesting because Boulez, again, we've just passed an interesting landmark for Boulez recently in December. I think would it have been his 100th? I can't remember. No, there's a big anniversary. And again, another of the great figures. Of course, as you say, he did a kind of ameliorate as he went on. And, I remember him from the later years, and he was very relaxed human being compared with the noise that we heard from him, probably from the Darmstadt years. So, Arnold Schoenberg, Luigi Nono, two of the great colossi, if that's a word, of 20th century music. Ulrike, thank you so much for this conversation. And there's so much more we could talk about this, and we should maybe take this on another occasion. For those of you watching, we're actually already hatching a plan for a composer we're going to put next to Schoenberg in 2025. Watch this space. Dr. Ulrike Anton, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for listening.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.